No.
It's September the 9th, 2020. This is 508, a show about Worcester, Worcester's premier ASMR experience. I'm Michael Benedetti.
Are you not introducing me anymore? Okay.
And this has been American.
Jeez, yeah, I've never had to introduce myself. This is terrible. I want a refund.
It's been 4.5 months since we did a show.
Has anything happened?
A few things have happened. We can catch up a little bit. We can't catch up super much. This isn't going to make up for those 4.5 months of news, but whatever. I feel like before we drill down into our sort of Worcester minutia week after week, that we should probably acknowledge some of these larger things. So the last time we did a show, COVID in Worcester was exploding. In a couple of weeks, the number of confirmed cases went from 212 to 1,200. In the last 4.5 months, that number is almost 6,000, which is bigger than 1,200, but not massively exponentially bigger than 1,200. It looked for a second like COVID cases were going to swamp our local hospitals. They set up the DCU Center for use as a field hospital, but it never quite got to that point. And now the number of people who are hospitalized in the city with COVID, according to the city's latest press release, is like 25 people. We had 98 new cases last week, and we had 3 deaths last week. That's where we are with that, I guess, Brendan.
So congratulations, Worcester.
Yeah, I mean, I want to congratulate us for encouraging people to become crazy preppers a month before toilet paper was no longer available. I hope that we sort of flattened the curve of toilet paper availability in our viewing audience.
That was the high watermark of my early COVID experience, was grabbing the last bidet available at Lowe's. Last one on the shelf, and then just walking away from all of that toilet paper madness.
That's awesome. Well, I tell you, I had a lot of Purell also stocked up at the beginning of this, and there were several months there where I was just like, oh yeah, who has the Purell, America? This guy's hands. But then I ran out, and then I was like, now I'm in the same boat as everybody else. Unless I had a 6-month stockpile of Purell, I was also going to suffer the Purell shortage sooner or later. At the beginning of the year, we said that that on the show this year, we would like to recognize every homicide victim in the city. As of the last time we did a show, there were not like any homicide victims, too many homicide victims. But over the summer, this has all just exploded, and there has been a ton of murders and a ton of violent activities this summer. It's been a bad time. The most recent homicide, I think, was the killing of Megan McNeil, who was shot August 16th and then later died on August 21st. So it's been a few weeks without any homicides. I hope we can continue that streak.
I've got nothing to offer, Mike.
Yeah, I got nothing to offer either. Yeah, and so, Brendan, do you want to talk about like Black Lives Matter or schools or zoning or commodities?
How about all those things?
I mean, we had some Black Lives Matter protests in Worcester, and some of them got rowdy, and some people got arrested. But so far as I recall, there were no serious injuries or deaths or anything like that coming out of those protests.
Nope.
And probably, not a lot of political action either coming out of those protests. Maybe a little bit.
Maybe a little bit. I think one of the things that was interesting and really nice to see were there's a significant number of young people who kind of took the reins on getting things organized. Whether or not that continues, it seems like it sort of petered out, at least in terms of a public facing sort of protest. But it was just really nice seeing younger folks doing their thing. Yeah. And
I don't have anything to add to that. I'll add on the show, I apologize if the background noise is very loud. I'm recording outside, and they are digging up the sidewalk across the street, and there's a helicopter that's been flying overhead, and they're either using a chainsaw or a leaf blower on the other side of the block. Just sort of normal summertime sounds, which is nice to hear.
Yeah.
How do you think our transition to the school year has gone this year?
I think it's pretty stupid.
That we're having school at all?
No. I mean, the school is just dumb. It's stay in school. And I guess it just bums me out that it doesn't even have to be the return to school. It could be the departure from school. The majority of conversations that I seem to have with people as school was first closed, people really believed they were going to be back in 2 weeks. and then they believed they were going to be back in a month, and then they believed that they were going to finish off the school year in person, and it just seemed it was kind of, I don't know how to really phrase this. It was weird, right? Because like from where I was standing in an ice cream shop, or whatever that's worth, it didn't seem like that was a realistic possibility. So on the back end of the school year, you ended up with a lot of students probably feeling as though they were left behind, if not actually being left behind, because the district wasn't necessarily prepared in delivering a remote education to them.
Yeah.
Throughout the summer, it seemed as though, at least from the state level, the marching orders were we're going back to school from the federal and the state level. And to some extent, I feel like people went through the motions as though that was going to happen. And I don't know if it's a school committee or the administration that should be more responsible in taking the lead on that. But obviously, they're not going back to in-person classes right away in totality. And again, it seems like a lot of resources and time were kind of mismanaged. I'll be curious to see how it goes. I mean, it's the delivery of a remote education is completely dependent upon technology, right? So if we don't have absolute equity in terms of access to technology, then we have failed objectively, right, as a community. And I'm just going to be really curious to see if we're going to be able to look at ourselves in the mirror 6 months, a year from now and say, hey, did we or did we not fail? And the metric is just that simple. Was there an equitable distribution of technology to make remote learning feasible for every student in the Worcester Public Schools? I just like to remind you, it's 2020. So the technology thing isn't really a challenge anymore. It shouldn't be a challenge. Like I over the summer, the city was racing to try and strong arm charter communications and to be a better partner in delivering equal access. Man, not to be a broken record, but we've been talking about how silly and disastrous this system is for access to internet in the city for over a decade now, right? Like, I have a hard time looking at people who are figuring stuff out for the first time in an emergency and then pretending as though they're working really, really hard to get it all sorted out. It's like, no, these are the things that are supposed to be sorted out well in advance just because it's the right thing to do, not because it's the thing you have to do now because of a state or federal mandate.
How do you think things have gone when we talk about the city of Worcester? We sort of talk about the schools, which is half of the budget, and the city, which is everything else the city of Worcester does. How do you feel like the city has done? If the schools side of this has been kind of a possible fiasco, how has the city done?
I don't know. I live in a weird parallel.
I want to say good things about the city. I feel like all through this pandemic, all kinds of institutions have done a garbage job on all levels, to an extent that I would not have expected they would do. The city of Worcester, honestly, I think has done fine. That they have a lot of policies being dictated to them by the state and by the feds, and so they're not coming up with their own COVID policy, right? In Massachusetts, we came up with our own COVID policy. The city is not doing that particularly, that I can tell. I feel like the city has done, the city is running, the streets are not full of garbage. The police and the fire department and whatever are out there doing their thing. City meetings seem to have transitioned over to video meetings without any particular fiasco. I don't know. So it seems like on that side of things, at least, this has not caused those guys a lot of problems. And one thing I realized too is that in some ways I feel like I take that for granted. I assume that there's this kind of flexibility in the system. So when the city of Worcester does what I think is a great job, it doesn't feel like they're doing a great job. It feels like they're doing the kind of job any of us think that we would do in this situation. It's just when we look at people who are doing a bad job that we say, oh, there's also a really bad way that this could have gone.
Yeah, and we didn't do, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as a whole did not do a terrible job of managing a crisis, right, in this case. But yeah, I don't know. Again, I guess I live in a parallel universe in some regard where it's all I can, I listened to an interview early on in this with Bill Gates where he was talking about how, the right thing to do, because it's a virus that has a roughly 2-week lifespan, is to just shut everything down and get everyone to stay put for 3 weeks, and then we're out of it, right? Like, and that just makes so much sense to me now, 6 months into watching, not just, and again, this part is personal, but like not watching businesses get like ripped to shreds, not watching like some institutions struggle, not watching individuals struggle, not watching a death toll increase massively. Just like the simple idea that it's like, wow, like we could have been past this within 3 weeks if we just had the wherewithal to not be morons. And I guess that's the thing that's my big takeaway from all of this, is that like we're really good as a species as just being dumb. and,
Yeah,
and
I mean,
to answer your question about Worcester, like that's also the way I look at it here too. Like I was really one of the many things that I learned over the last 6 months is like, there were cities and towns in the United States that were left completely unaffected by the Spanish flu or the flu of 1918. Specifically because they they basically isolated themselves from the rest of their state or the rest of the country. And I know that sounds like such a completely impractical thing, and like, how could you ever do that? Like, how's the economy going to? People are dead, and like people are dead because here in the city of Worcester, like friends, loved ones, family members, they're no longer with us because we made really, really selfish decisions and decided to bicker over whether or not wearing a mask is a violation of your God-given rights as an American.
Well, I tell you, the libertarian side of me, which is the only side that would normally complain about being forced to wear a mask, is super pumped that I've not been on video surveillance on a regular basis in like 4.5 months.
Yeah, I know.
So I continue. I have a mask within arm's reach right now. I mean, I want to acknowledge too that like, the last time we were doing a show was when we didn't have a lot of information, in part because it was early in the disease, and in part because our public health people at the national level completely failed us. Honestly, in retrospect, I think I would have liked to see the state of Massachusetts shut down a week earlier and then reopen like multiple months earlier. That like this disease has been deadly on the low end of initial estimates. There were estimates 10 times. We could have had millions of people instead of hundreds of thousands of people die. And so when the estimates are like that, I think it's reasonable to say like, okay, let's like be cautious until the CDC or whoever can really get a sense of what's going on. Let's just shut stuff down. Let's just cut stuff off. Let's just have less of a problem to deal with. It's a drastic step too, so I understand the reluctance to do that. But anyway, at this point, it just feels like, in part because social distancing works really well, and especially voluntary social distancing works really well to cut down the disease. And in part because the disease is not as deadly as initially feared, there's a lot of resentment against the continued shutdown. And personally, I would like to see us open up, I don't know, man. I would like to see us open up pretty soon. Like, I feel like the lesson that I learned is like, the next time the pandemic comes through, I would love it if the Commonwealth shut down immediately and was like, we're just going to do a 2-week shutdown immediately until we have a sense of what's going on, until we have some kind of reasonable numbers, better numbers than we had in February 2020 about our new pandemic. We're going to shut down for 2 weeks, nip everything in the bud, and then assume that we're going to reopen in 2 weeks unless we find out something really bad. And that would have been an interesting way for the state to do things. It would have just been to shut stuff down earlier, shut things down for 2.5 months, and then do a phased reopening and be back on top. Yeah, I don't know. This whole thing has been, this is one of the reasons this has been the worst week ever, Brendan. I feel like, or the worst year ever. Like, I feel like no matter where you are politically and no matter what your weird intersection of your political beliefs are with your virological understanding, like, how could you cannot be happy with the situation. You either think that COVID is a giant fraud and conspiracy and therefore we never should have shut down and this is terrible that we shut down at all, or else you're really worried that like people you love are going to die or have like lung scarring or whatever, and therefore you're mad that I'm even on here talking about opening back up. Who can be happy with this current situation? Nobody can be happy.
Nobody.
If you want everything to burn down, well, everything's not going to burn down, dumb anarchist kid. Sorry. Like, it's not even close to everything burning down. But if you want things to be stable and nice, no, not that way either.
Yeah.
Who can like this? Who can like this level?
Terrible season. Fire the writers.
This is like, what's that thing they say about the Black Eyed Peas? It's rock and roll for people who don't like rock and roll and rap for people who don't like rap. Like, this is like this COVID-19 is like the Black Eyed Peas of pandemics, Brendan.
It kind of is, yeah.
Nobody can like it. Nobody can like it. In commodities news, Brent crude oil is $40 a barrel, down 8% on the week and down 32% on the year, but doubled from the last time we did a show. So lately it's gone down. Since a year ago it went down, but it went way down at the beginning of the year, and now it's on the way back up from like April.
Way to go,
Bitcoin is $10,243, down 10% on the week, unchanged on the year, up 50% from the last time we did a show.
Yeah.
I was just talking to somebody yesterday about who was sort of figuring out, like, are they adult enough to have a 401k, an IRA, and really get into that whole thing. And I was like, you got to just try not to time the market, man, because you're never going to do it. And this is a perfect example, right? If you bought Bitcoin a year ago, you would be like, if you bought Bitcoin a week ago, you'd be like, oh, no. And if you bought Bitcoin in April, because the 508 show was no longer on and you were bored and wanted to do something on your computer, you would be like, yes, 50% more money, baby. So it's all about timing, right? It just swings, these things swing just so much. You'll be excited to know that Worcester's air quality index is 27, due mostly to particulate matter below 2.5 micrometers. 27 is in the good range, which is below 50, and in particular below 30. There is an ozone component. The ozone air quality index is 17. And partially I'm looking at this because I am, in a couple of days, flying out to Northern California for a week, which is going to be exciting because both I'm going to get to see all of these different COVID regulations, and I will, let me tell you, America, I am going to 100% comply with anything that the state or local authorities are telling me to do. Don't worry about that. And in fact, my loved ones have higher standards than the state authorities in Massachusetts, so I will in fact be even more scrupulous. But man, I'm also, it's just going to be a crazy week to go out there. The air quality index where I'm going to be staying is like 120. You know, it's in the, like, this might cause actual concern range. You
want to buy a respirator?
Well, I'm bringing a respirator. Luckily, the place that I'm staying has a HEPA filter, so that place will be clean. And I am bringing just my N95, just my little disposable respirator. You know, I feel it's going to be a week of just breathing garbage air, and that's not going to be great, but I don't know. I've been in California when there's been forest fires before, maybe not this level. As of July, the most recent month for which numbers were available, the producer price index for construction sand, gravel, and, that's right, crushed stone was 364, basically unchanged since the last show, unchanged on the month, and up 4% on the year. Let me tell you, America, construction sand, gravel, and crushed stone has been your safest investment over the last 12 months.
That's where I should have sunk all my money.
Yeah. One reason that we bring this up is that apparently there's a lot of weird, illegal mining for crushed stone that happens not in the city of Worcester, but in some of the surrounding towns. And this is sometimes of a concern for them when people have a vacant lot and they just decide to turn it into a gravel pit.
Insane.
Yeah, and you know, the price of that stuff was going up for a while. At least I guess it's going back up. I think mostly Chinese demand for that stuff. Yeah, man. I don't know what else to tell you. I mean, there's lots of, like I said, there's lots of zoning. There's been so much zoning stuff and so much crime stuff and so much policy stuff we can talk about on a local level. And I love it when we can talk about things on a local level because I feel like the local level, you know, I don't know, you know, I feel like what goes on in local politics affects your life at least as much as what goes on in national politics. Yeah. But national politics is all people ever talk about. And it's the only place we have any analysis in this society or almost any journalism in this society. The journalists who cover local politics in Worcester do a heroic job, but there's not too many of them. And the amount of the quality of conversation around local politics in Worcester is very, very low. You know, it's even lower than the price of Brent crude oil.
How do you feel about how do you feel about the way the summer rolled out from a journalism perspective? You know, when it came to coverage of, say, our initial Black Lives Matter protests or even COVID-19, do you feel that these local journalists were up to the task of covering?
I feel like they did okay. There's not that many of them. Right. I would have liked to see a lot more coverage of. Yeah, I would like to see a lot more coverage of all of this stuff. I guess Black Lives Matter protests, they did a pretty good job, in part because it's like the analysis of cell phone videos at a protest/riot is, you know, a recreational activity for much of this country. So if you can put it in that sense, then people are going to be all over it, you know, arguing about like, well, the cops are bad because this or this particular incident did or did not happen on this particular evening, on this particular street corner. People love that kind of stuff. Like that doesn't feel so much like that feels like in some ways like people's ability to argue locally a fragment of a national political conversation.
Yeah.
Like I would have loved to see a lot more coverage of COVID stuff. On the local level. I guess they did an okay job. I just don't feel like there's anybody who's like writing from a sort of like somebody who's been writing about the city of Worcester for 40 years, who's also writing about COVID stuff, who's really putting it in perspective. Like Nick Katsopoulos sometimes does that kind of perspective. Yeah. But that's the kind of thing that I really appreciate. You know, somebody who's out there walking around, looking at the places, looking at the homeless shelters we've set up.
I think I told you this on one of your visits down to the store, but one of the things that snuck up on me that I thought was really cool regarding COVID was, so I listened to a science podcast called Science Versus from Gideon, and their go-to person for COVID coverage on a national level and international, but mostly national, was this Dr. Ann Sheehy, who is a professor up at Holy Cross. And it was really neat to hear somebody who's, from a research perspective, seems to be like on the forefront of the research side of things. And it's not that she was ever saying anything that ran afoul of like what we were being told or whatnot on a local level, but it was very much ahead of the curve. So the information that would be coming down maybe a week or two later, you know, she was just kind of happy to spout off via her role as a commentator on this podcast. And that was really fun to kind of realize that there are people literally right here in the city who are extremely capable of doing that messaging. And they're not necessarily tapped into.
You know, people sometimes talk about where's my flying car. You know, we talk about how like our future, like if you live 100 years ago, you would see so much more technological change in a short period of time than you would if you were living now. But in some ways, we're seeing a huge amount of disruption that we're not acknowledging as important, or that just doesn't feel like it's part of our narrative, but is part of our narrative. You know, like, for example, the death of newspapers or whatever, right? The total transformation of the way that journalism is done, right? Because like forever in this country, journalism was mostly done by newspapers, and newspapers were mostly the classified ads subsidizing you to be able to have 3 people covering City Hall full time.
Right.
And that obviously doesn't work anymore. The newspaper classified ads don't matter. And so you don't have anything to subsidize 3 reporters at City Hall. So how are you even running this business? We're just seeing even more of this disruption happening now. And people are talking about it some, but people are not talking about it as much as they are talking about other things, which is frustrating. Like, I mean, I feel like we've just seen this COVID is like presumably going to turn education upside down. You know, people will speculate about which colleges might go bankrupt the quickest, and Clark has been on some people's short lists of colleges that are just positioned badly for that. And you know, this whole like remote, doing a semester of remote learning or whatever some colleges are expecting, or even some weeks of remote learning, I think are really making people realize, like, just rethink, like, what am I getting out of college? Why am I doing this? Why is higher education so freaking expensive? So it seems like that whole part of the economy is going to be destabilized by this. I wanted to ask you actually a question. Like, so I think that we've seen, was it Unum or one of the big insurance companies in downtown Worcester, I believe, is like, oh yeah, all of our people are going to be like basically working from home indefinitely. I think they're moving into a different building or a smaller building now. Just like this idea that like the amount of Americans who had ever worked from home has basically like doubled at this point, maybe tripled at this point. Right. And the amount of Americans who regularly work from home will stay high forever, probably. Like we sort of have broken through that barrier, which seems like, I don't know, it seems like on the residential side of real estate, it means that you have to buy a larger house, potentially. If you have that opportunity, you would certainly like to buy a larger house and have a home office and extend that home office so that you could work in a quiet area, not surrounded by a bunch of screaming kids. But on the commercial side, suddenly, like, yeah, like, you know, I mean, you don't need a giant building anymore for your guys. What do you need, a storefront? You need a post office box? Like, what do you need for your insurance company ultimately?
Yeah.
So if you could please speak as small businessman Brendan Melican. I mean, do you have any insight to this? Do you feel like you've seen commercial or rents in the city like whipsawing one way or another?
I don't think, I'll be honest, I don't think people are thinking that far forward on a local level, other than the really large businesses for whom that makes sense, right? Like you mentioned Unum. I know a significant number of our larger employers have told their employees, like, yeah, there's no chance of don't even think about coming back to an office unless you have to before the start of the new year. And even any time after that is completely dependent upon a vaccine being available. Yeah, I think your half point that you made halfway through was the correct one, that it's going to be a reshuffling of the deck in terms of commercial real estate and holdings. If you can, if you're going to figure that a significant portion of fixed costs for any business is real estate, why continue that practice if you can go a full year successfully and not have that cost be part of your bottom line? The one company that I've seen speak against that philosophy has been Netflix. Obviously, it's nothing to do with Worcester, but
Yeah.
Netflix seems really, really eager to get people back to work in a physical office space. Yeah, I don't know.
It makes sense.
I think
The few virtual businesses that I know, yeah, go ahead.
The only thing that makes sense to me about an office place is if you rely upon an old school management style where like walking around the office and looking over people's shoulders is somehow like indicative of doing something, like from a managerial perspective, right? Like it has never made sense to me at all that as an employee, like you've got a list of things to do. You've got a period of time that presumably they need to be done by. That's really all an employer needs to be concerned about, especially when so many people are working via a computer or a terminal of some sort. The idea that you need to be in spend an hour getting to a physical space every day to then settle in, and you're going to do 8 hours of diligent work, and then drive home, another hour the other direction. It's just kind of silly. And I think it goes to a lot of those studies that have been done over the years that people hate acknowledging, but never do a really good job of finding fault in, showing that like it's roughly like 80% of the workday is wasted. Like
yes.
Most people aren't doing anything. And the
people cannot be that much less productive than they already are. There's just not that much. You can't be less than 0% productive. Assuming your business is set up reasonably so your employees are not actively sabotaging the company.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess when you get down to it, it's our productivity has gotten so high, but that doesn't necessarily have as much to do with the human component. There's so much automation and technology involved. There's only so much left for us to do, with the exception of the people that over the last 6 months haven't gotten the opportunity to work from home and stay safe, who are in our grocery stores, our convenience stores, our Home Depots, our Lowe's, our Targets, and obviously our healthcare institutions. But that's the thing that I really think we need to be focused on, is the folks that I don't think there's any other way to say it, but that we're taking it full advantage of right now, right? I mean, the people that were working in supermarkets, they look shell-shocked, right? Like you and I can discuss all day about how uncomfortable this has been for us over the last 6 months. Meanwhile, they're like, there are young people, there are poor people, there are people that are working third and fourth jobs that they don't get a say in how they feel right now. They just have to go back to work. And that's the part of the system that seems fundamentally flawed to me at this point.
Yeah. Well, I don't know anybody who works in a grocery store. I don't know. Some of the people who I know who have worked in grocery stores have been laid off recently. But, just the whole, like, all the cleaning protocols and whatever, just seems like it's made the job more of a stressful job for them. I was just going to say, the virtual organizations I know that have been effective organizations, part of what either the people who all work in the organization are people who already know each other from meeting up in meet space, or they very intentionally have once a year or once every 6 months, ideally, a weekend retreat for their employees. That's one thing that I think, I'm curious to see how this goes in upcoming years. I'll use Unum as an example. I know nothing about Unum. I don't know anybody who works for Unum. This is just company X. But, Unum can say, great, everybody's going to work from home, in part because you're sitting there doing your job and you're emailing with a bunch of people, and you're chatting with a bunch of people, and you're IMing with a bunch of people, and you're Zooming with a bunch of people, all of whom you have known for years probably. And so you know how to work with them, what their style is like. You have all these social bonds you can rely on, et cetera. Somebody else comes into the team, they're never meeting anybody else in person now, or they're spending almost no time with anybody else in person. And like as turnover happens, suddenly the people who actually met each other and gotten to hang out together, that number gets lower and lower and lower. And the question for me is just like, does the virtual organization work well with people who know each other less? And certainly there are plenty of organizations that can make it work, and maybe it's just a different style of organization. And I don't think that it's necessarily worth the trade-off I don't think that having that social connection is always going to be worth the trade-off of operating the office and forcing people to come into the office either.
Right.
There's also a statistic, which I've recited on the show, I should have looked up beforehand, about every 10 minutes of additional commuting you have to do a day. In order for your life satisfaction to remain the same, you would have to be paid like an extra $10,000 a year or something. It's a surprisingly high number, the amount of money that people just hate commuting. People commute long distances, but ultimately when people are surveyed about it, people hate commuting. Yeah. Just the idea of saying like, basically like, okay, you have to work out of your house, which potentially is terrible, especially if you are a parent and now you're having to spend half your day intentionally ignoring your children, which could be difficult, both logistically and emotionally. But in some ways, you're kind of like giving this person a bonus of like $40,000 a year. You're being like a huge, you have more free time and you have less of a pain in your ass now because you're working from home. So for some people, it's been great. Again, for other people, it's just been a nightmare. They have to be around their family all the time, or their apartment is crowded or loud, or their house is just not set up for it right.
If you can throw this in the show notes, Mike, Sam Harris's podcast, and please, if you're going to send any hate mail to the podcast.
I'm looking for a pencil.
Yeah, no, but if you're going to send any hate mail to the podcast because I mentioned Sam Harris, send it directly to Mike and not me. But Sam Harris's podcast, Making Sense, episode number 194, he interviewed Matt Mullenweg from Automatic. Automatic is the company that oversees WordPress, which both you and I have used for quite some time. A lot of us have used WordPress. So they're a fully remote organization. They have one small office space up in the Bay Area now that is mostly where their lawyers work out of. But their entire team is distributed and global. And it was really interesting to hear the person that, I guess you could probably make the argument, kind of came up with that idea of having a large, scalable organization that's fully global and fully remote. Talk through, in this context regarding COVID, what that's like and how it should kind of be the future of the workplace for everybody. There are obviously some places where it doesn't make sense, like the grocery store or over, if you're at an ice cream shop, right? That is not going to be.
Speaking of ignoring children, Brent, you got to go over there. Don't be on this show. Okay. Go ahead.
But Matt did just a great job of talking about what that culture actually looks like, and specifically to your point about groups of people that might not ever actually meet. Automatic does do what you mentioned. They have an annual retreat that the entire company goes to. They pick a different country every year to go to. They fly everybody up there. And then they have like quarterly retreats for teams and whatnot. So they're definitely in-person engagement, but the in-person engagement isn't around work. The in-person engagement is just to like, hey, we're actually human beings and let's spend some time together. It really sounded like a fascinating workplace, and very much one that I wish that I could have figured out a way to be a part of when I was a younger person, right? Like, probably sailed for me. But
and these stumbling blocks I'm talking to also, there are these bad organizational sides of having everybody work from home, are things that I know there's organizations that have figured out a different way of running, that's not so much of a problem. And I feel like these styles of running an organization don't seem like they're super mainstream yet. Maybe management consulting kind of people talk about this stuff all the time, but I have not really seen a lot of mainstream conversation about work acknowledging that you got to do this stuff, man. Well, you got to build these connections.
Isn't that kind of part of the facade that we have in our culture, though, that like you're just not allowed to argue with the idea that at some point in time you're going to be an adult And that
Mhm.
means you have to go to an office 5 days a week for 8 hours a day. And
Yeah.
you're not allowed to ask the question like, well, why can't I do this from home? Like, this is
Yeah.
everything I do here, I could do from home. Why isn't that possible? Like, you're just not allowed to ask that
Yeah.
question.
Had we met? Had we met in person when we started doing this podcast?
I
I'm
don't think
trying to.
so.
I
No,
don't think so either.
you used to do it by the phone.
Yeah. I mean,
We hadn't
if
even
we had
seen
met in
each other.
person, it was for 5 minutes. Yeah. 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 I don't know. Worcester, man. I feel like next week we'll talk more about the plot of Worcester this year and it just seems like a bad plot. It just feels like a year where just like everything is,
Are we even getting renewed this season, Mike?
everything has just been thought bad. This is like the season of Felicity, which is all about time travel. Or this is just a season where this is like the season of Friday Night Lights where Landry becomes a murderer. Like, and they just like, in later seasons, they're just like, forget it. It never happened. It never happened. He's just a nerdy guy, People are always like, oh, that Landry is such a loser. And nobody's ever like, he killed a man with a pipe. And it's public knowledge, and he got away with it. How can you call this dude a nerd? He's a thug, man. He's a tough guy. They were just like, forget it. Bad idea for the show. This feels like that. Unfortunately, the city of Worcester's narrative, as much as we can rewrite it, reality impinges to a large extent on what we can say about the city. Brendan, we'll see you. I'll see you later, I guess, huh?
Yeah, one of these months,
All
quarters,
right.
years.
All right. Well, that's all for this week's 508. We will welcome your questions and comments at pieandcoffee@gmail.com. Speaking of comments, when you mentioned bringing up Sam Harris, Worcester, Brendan also may be Worcester's #1 Joe Rogan fan. So send us some angry emails about that. I want to start calling him the Joe Rogan of Worcester on this podcast, but he doesn't like to be called that so much.
No, that's a terrible thing to call somebody.
Joe Rogan's cool, man. He's bald. He's got a cool bald head. There's probably other things about him that are cool. I don't know. Till next week, remember, Worcester, you can bench more than you think you can.
But probably not more than Joe Rogan. Have a good one, Mike. Take care.